quick thank you to Dr. Rollins for advising me and helping me out every step of the way. So, my presentation today will be Turkey's unique geography shaped its relationship with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and the European Union. So the purpose of my presentation today is to examine how Turkey's unique geography influences its relationship with NATO and the EU, as I stated. And to do this, I will analyze Turkey's geopolitics through relevant case studies. Geopolitics, the definition being politics as influenced by geographic factors. And Turkey's geography and geopolitics are leading it towards a trend of strategic autonomy, is what I found out through my studies. A couple key terms I'd like to go over first. You might notice I spell Turkey a little differently than what is commonly seen. In Turkey, they pronounce it Türkiye, not Turkey. And this is to kind of foster a sense of nationalism and pride in their country, in their ethnicity, in their state. And also to not be confused with the North American bird, the turkey, which is a real quote from the president. Another term up there, Turkic versus Turkish. Turkic is an ethnic group and linguistic group versus Turkish. Turkish is what you would call somebody who is ethnically a Turk, but also a resident of Turkey, regardless of ethnicity and regardless of language. Supranational organization is a collective of countries that come together either for a military or economic alliance. Traditionally, it's 3 or more countries to become supranational. And the two I'll focus on today are the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, formed in 1949, which is a collective defense of countries in the North Atlantic there, North America, Europe, and the EU, formed in 1993. It is an economic and political collective of countries in Europe. Geographic overview of the area that I will be presenting and the area I study is Turkey, of course, but where is Turkey? It is at the intersection of Europe and Asia, this being the Anatolian Peninsula, or Asia Minor. This is the part of Turkey that is in Asia or the Middle East, and the Balkan Peninsula, which is the portion of Turkey that is in Europe. The Balkan Peninsula being 3% of the total land and 10 to 15% of the total population. This is what makes Turkey what is commonly known as the bridge between Europe and Asia. Turkey is also surrounded by the Black, Aegean, and Mediterranean Sea, and it controls key choke points of the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits. And Turkey's geography in recent years has placed it very near to conflict zones. So just a quick overview of a map of Turkey, where it is. As you can see in the southeast corner of this picture here, there's Turkey with the Anatolian Peninsula right here and the Balkan Peninsula to the northwest of the country. And just a closer view of Turkey itself. And now getting into NATO and the EU and how Turkey fits into this. This is just a quick map of NATO and the EU. Member countries, candidate countries. As you can see, NATO and the EU have a very strong grasp on Europe and a lot of overreach in Europe. It's very rare for a country to be not a part of any one of these groups in Europe. And as you can see, based on the color coding, Turkey is currently an EU candidate and a NATO member. So getting into a little more about Turkey and NATO. Turkey joined NATO in 1952, and it is often considered a very valuable member. They hold those crucial choke points of the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits, which allow transit through the Black Sea to the Aegean Sea, which would then lead to open water. They have the second largest active duty military personnel in NATO. Their geography grants them a lot of leeway and strategic importance within the organization. And because of this, they're able to kind of stray away from the constrictions of NATO and pursue a little bit more of what I've referred to as strategic autonomy. So this is just a map overview of the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits. As you can see, the Bosphorus Straits lead to the Black Sea, which grant access to the Sea of Marmara, and then the Dardanelles Strait, and then to the Aegean Sea. Turkey is the only country based off the Montreux Convention that is allowed to control access to these straits. And that is what makes it a very key member of NATO. So a little more on how Turkey's geography affects it strategically. They are very close proximity to unstable regions, which can often foster security concerns, but make it a first responder to regional issues for NATO. An example of this is the Syrian civil war, which occurred from 2011 to 2024. Syria was going through crisis, and as well as Turkey combating ISIS from 2013 to the present day. This civil war and instability in the region caused migration crises, which led to increased terror attacks in both Turkey and the EU. Because of these security concerns, Turkey often has to balance its NATO needs in the Middle East while maintaining its own regional power. Oftentimes, the treatment of Kurds, which is the largest ethnic minority in Turkey and the largest stateless nation in the world, is at odds with NATO and the international community. And this is just a quick map of the internal displacement of migrants in Syria seeking refuge, kind of in the Middle East and in their region. As you can see, over 3 million refugees were fleeing towards Turkey and created a massive humanitarian crisis. So one of the case studies that I was observing was Turkey's relationship with Russia and its involvement in the Black Sea. Turkey stands as the southern flank against Russia and is key to Black Sea defense. But once again, Turkey is balancing its own NATO obligations with its own actions, and this can be demonstrated by economic ties with Russia versus NATO's stance against Russia. And the Turk Stream pipeline, which runs under the Black Sea, is a joint venture between Russia and Turkey economically. And this indecisiveness can often lead to erosion of NATO trust and NATO power projection. And here is just, as I mentioned, the Turk Stream pipeline. It runs under the Black Sea from Russia to the Balkan Peninsula in Turkey and then to Europe. And this just kind of highlights Turkey's dual role of towing the line and balancing its relationships. It patrols the Black Sea against Russian aggression, but at the same time, under the Black Sea is an economic venture between a country that is supposed to be at odds with Russia. So I talked a little about NATO and Turkey and their relationship together. So now I will transition into Turkey and the EU's relationship. Turkey is not a member of the EU. It is a candidate country, an official candidate. The EU places greater emphasis on political cohesion and accountability for political actions. Turkey has been a candidate since 1999, with accession talks stalled for failure to uphold the Copenhagen criteria. Copenhagen criteria being the standards every country that is a candidate must meet to have full accession to the EU. And some of these violations include the aftermath of the 2016 failed coup, which resulted in human rights violations, democratic backsliding, and the jailing of political dissidents. Additionally, Turkey's European question of their identity has been called into question by some EU members. A portion of Turkey lies in Europe, most of it does not. So it raises the question, is Turkey even European? Should they be in the organization at all? As well as the treatment of minorities. I mentioned the Kurds a little bit. Turkey views the PKK, or the Kurdistan Workers' Party, as a terrorist group. And Kurds are often suppressed both linguistically and ethnically. Migration as well is a central issue, as I mentioned before, as a result of the Syrian civil war. Migration often allows Turkey leverage, but often reinforces the negative opinions that the EU has. And this is because Turkey often uses migrants as kind of bargaining chips towards the EU, and there'll be more on that later. The migration issues, as I stated, over 5 million people displaced by conflict in Syria in 2015. Millions fled to Turkey, which formed a massive humanitarian crisis for the country. Turkey often decided the best solution was to push migrants towards EU borders and get them out from their own borders. And this would often be at odds with the EU and governments within the EU that faced surging migrant issues and strain on social services. And this eventually led to a deal between Turkey and the EU that Turkey would receive economic aid from the EU if they house migrants and police their borders a little more. This proves Turkey and the EU can cooperate, but integration is still a ways off. And this is just a quick map on the left side here, showcasing the migration crisis. As you can see, Turkey is the most common entrance in 2015 into Europe by migrants. And the map on the right here just shows the main migrant route from Turkey up to Germany. And as you can see, based off the key, a lot of countries at this time had very little border security just because of how the EU operated and the suddenness of this crisis, and began to tighten their border security as the crisis went on. So Turkey's talks and accession into the EU has completely stalled as of recently, and this is because of, as I've mentioned, their failure to meet the Copenhagen criteria. I mentioned the failed coup aftermath, but another key criteria that they do not uphold is the recognition of Cyprus, of EU member. Turkey does not recognize the sovereignty of Cyprus. They occupy half the island, the northern part, and so that is often at odds with the EU when you can't even recognize a full member. Additionally, the current president, Erdogan, is moving away from EU aspirations. The feeling seems kind of mutual. This allows Turkey a degree of freedom to operate with Russia and whoever they want to do business with economically. And neither side will really fully admit that they are not right for each other. Turkey still remains an official candidate despite talks being stalled, and the EU won't formally remove them as a candidate, and Turkey will still claim they are seeking status in the EU, especially amongst the elite populations of Turkey, the more wealthy. And geography, of course, amplifies these concerns, and as demonstrated through the migration case study. There was some concerns that if Turkey was brought into the EU, all those migrants would be an EU problem, and as well as other concerns. So I mentioned strategic autonomy before, and kind of what I've discovered through my research in the paper. Turkey is more than just unique physical geography. They are not quite European or Middle Eastern. They have their very own unique Turkish identity, their own unique culture, language, religion, and ethnicity, as well as a very strong national identity, all contribute to this Turkish identity. And this is kind of paralleled with their growing desire to dictate their own affairs through strategic autonomy. An example of this, of them both straying away from EU and NATO constrictions, are Turkey's purchase of Russian missile systems. This was a grave concern for NATO. They feared that purchasing these Russian missiles would compromise NATO security and NATO power projection, and it made Turkey look like an unsteady NATO ally. Additionally, treatment of the Kurds is often at odds with NATO and the EU, and as well as Turkey's own desire to become more of a regional power, to dictate its own affairs through what it deems necessary foreign policy. And so to conclude, geography simultaneously enhances Turkey's strategic value while also hindering it. NATO benefits from Turkey's geography, whereas the EU would not. NATO can overlook political concerns for geographic gain, whereas the EU cannot. And geography will always remain a critical factor in global politics and an interconnected world. And additionally, as I found and stated, Turkey is breaking the status quo of supranationalism by pursuing its own strategic autonomy and status as a regional power. Turkey will continue to balance between these groups, its region, and its own identity, mirroring its actual location as a bridge between continents. Time for questions.